in terms you can't have a state that was developmental but also democratic. And I think that Meles spent a considerable amount of time trying to make sense of that.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid criticism, because like, to me at least, the democratic developmental state, like I don't necessarily use that term because I don't think it makes sense. And even in this articulation, it didn't necessarily make sense. So Meles was able to articulate it quite clearly, or articulate his vision of it quite clearly, but they were also, it was used in a very kind of fluid and not necessarily very concrete, precise terms by other folks in the EPRDF. It was almost intentionally kind of changing color almost, because there wasn't a very clear understanding of what democratic developmental state is. Again, that seems like a contradiction in terms, because an element of the developmental state is that you have a state strong enough to kind of ram through these reforms and these decisions and these economic directions, regardless of what the people kind of on the ground want, which is in large part the record of the EPRDF era of governance. And I suppose one could envision kind of a world in which democratic norms, and not in the kind of Western liberal democracy type way, but at the very basic level, like stakeholder engagement, one could envision a way in which this could be done. And I think sometimes there were attempts to implement this. So for instance, when issues regarding land was raised, you're supposed to have these committees that consult with the people who are facing eviction or expropriation of their land or dispossession. And you're supposed to have conversations with the people before you carry out these processes. But we know that in practice, these just became ways to tell people what needed to be done rather than to actually consult with them about what they believe ought to be done. So there are, if one wants to be very, very generous, there are ways to incorporate democratic governance, at least in some limited sense, in this developmental state ideology. I do not think that's what the record of the EPRDF era of governance has shown us, because that democratic element of the democratic developmental state was sorely lacking in many instances.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, Fifi, why do you think the whole Meles project fell apart? And it has. The reason why we are where we are is because it had failed. And is that because the system was always going to fail, or is that because of the people who took over weren't qualified enough to sustain the project? Is it them who pushed the country off the cliff into the abyss? What exactly happened in your assessment?
That's a very, very, very big question, Tech. You're essentially asking me to diagnose the problem of the Ethiopian state. It's a very big ask. I don't know that I am qualified or have enough knowledge to answer that, but I think I can point to some things that contributed to this, right? Because I think it's very difficult to have one reason that led to all the chaos that we're seeing right now. And I think I think of three things, right? So Meles is a very divisive figure in Ethiopian politics. There are some who kind of are huge fans of everything that he did and believed and spoke, and those who see him as a terrible leader and an even worse person. Right? Regardless of where you stand, I think a rational assessment of the legacy of Meles would indicate that, and this is corroborated by reporting and journalists and scholars and people who have come in contact with him, that he was an exceptionally intelligent man, that he was very well read, that he believed in research, and that this developmental state ideology didn't kind of come out of thin air. So he had a clear vision of what he wanted to implement. And I think when he was alive, he was able to implement it. He was able to kind of bring this vision to fruition. I don't know if it's to the full extent of what he envisioned, but he was able to produce these results. And I think what we see is that is kind of a focus on the leader rather than leadership, rather than kind of the party as a whole being attuned to what the long-term vision was. contributed to some of the failings of the system, right? Because things kind of started to go sideways after Meles died, and it almost felt as though he was the one kind of holding everything together. And I think that's a big problem, because when your whole plan hinges on one person of exceptionally above average intelligence, then when that one person leaves the picture, then it leaves the rest of the country kind of in a scramble. And I think we saw elements of that. I wouldn't say that's the only factor, but I think that played a factor. And in terms of the system itself, as I mentioned, it had some long-term contradictions that I don't think it was able to adequately grapple with, let alone address, right? This contradiction between developmental state ideology on the one hand and multinational federalism on the other was at the center of the protests that emerged in 2014 as well, right? When we see the master plan and its intentions and the very strong reaction it provoked from the affected communities, we see that this kind of contradiction that was simmering in the back wasn't really addressed. And it was either going to happen then or it's going to happen at a later date. But this kind of this outpouring of outrage would have happened. So there is that. And I think contradictions are plenty in the trajectory of Ethiopian history, and oftentimes they go unaddressed and they boil into much stronger opposition. But with that said, I also think that had the PP, the replacement to the successor to the EPRDF, had it been able to follow the course, had it adhered to developmental state ideology, had it had even a clear ideological, economic, and political foundation, had it had really the capacity to govern a country as large and as diverse and as embedded in contradiction as Ethiopia, then things might look different. And it's very difficult to deal with counterfactuals, but it's impossible to look at the record of Abiy Ahmed and the Prosperity Party and not point out the number of ways that the crises in the country right now are rooted in a lot of the decisions that they have made. Of course, these decisions are also kind of determined, these circumstances are determined by the historical evolution of the political arena in that country. But I think to ascribe all of the crisis to these systemic issues and not look at the choices and the decisions that were taken and continue to be taken by Abiy Ahmed and others in the PP regime would be to miss a huge chunk of the picture, perhaps the most important and most significant part of why these political crises have emerged. And a part of it is rooted, I think, in the lack of a very clear ideology. But yeah, a part of it is just kind of individual decision making, right? Particularly around the war and these military campaigns that have been getting waged and continue to be waged today. Yeah, so I think those are some of the key components of it. And I think when we widen the scope a little bit, when we're looking at regional geopolitical effects and we're looking at alliances and partnerships in neighboring countries, then what the source of some of the current crises are, I think definitely starts to come into view a lot more sharply as well.
Well, you said that you weren't the right person to diagnose the ills of the country, but that was as thorough and detailed a diagnosis as I've ever heard or read. So thank you for that, Fifi, and I hope some of the people who will be listening to us will pick on some of the pointers you mentioned and explore and try to understand even at a more detail. I think generally Ethiopia, in my judgment, remains to be one of the least studied country in terms of the ideas that define the country and why certain ideas failed and why others succeeded, although there aren't that many that have. And it was excellent that you gave them some pointers. So if we could, so we started with the Prosperity Party, and then we went to Meles, and I think it was only right that we spent a considerable amount of time studying and trying to understand Meles, because he had an outsized role in Ethiopia. There's no denying that. People could disagree or agree with the way he did things, but there is no denying that he had an outsized and of paramount role in Ethiopia. But I think EPRDF itself was also born from political movements and questions that have always existed in Ethiopia, perhaps starting from the 1960s, or I don't know when you would like to start. But EPRDF was kind of an answer to some of those questions that the Derg regime couldn't answer. But those questions that spurred the student movement and all the political movements in Ethiopia over the last half a century. What are some of the defining political questions in Ethiopia that remain unanswered, Fifi?
Sure, yeah. And I think to understand EPRDF era policy or ideology, you're right, we definitely need to go back. And I think the natural starting point for me is the student movement of the 1960s and 70s. This is the era in which university students, primarily in Addis Ababa, began a movement against the imperial government and Haile Selassie's rule, and they demanded a number of changes. And I think the issues that they raised at this time continue to be as pertinent today as they were in the 1960s and 70s. And we have seen successive regimes addressing some of these issues in their own ways. And some have built on the responses of previous regimes, and some have attempted to undo or reverse course. So the student revolution was vast and diverse, but the three really key questions that I think were really at the center of it are the land question, the nationalities question, and the democracy question. The land question primarily because in the era in which it emerged, there was massive inequality in terms of land holdings in Ethiopia. So you had some scenarios where between the 1940s and 70s, I believe you had 70% of the land in that country that was owned and controlled by a very, very tiny minority of the population, oftentimes associated with Haile Selassie or the aristocracy. And so a lot of the students that came from farming families and communities lived through these inequalities and experiences. And what that type of inequality in land holding means is that a lot of the farmers, a huge proportion of the farmers, have been reduced to tenants on their own land. So they are tenants, they farm these tiny plots of land, they have to pay taxes to the king, they have to pay taxes to their local landlord, they have to pay taxes oftentimes to the church, they have to provide services for the landlord, they have to provide gifts every now and then. They have to, if a campaign is called, and this is before Haile Selassie's era, if a military campaign is called, they have to go up and they have to pick up arms and fight on behalf of their local ruler. Or if soldiers are going to go on a campaign, they have to give them their home to stay, and all of these things. Essentially, the living conditions of the vast majority of the peasantry in Ethiopia at the time was exceptionally horrendous. And so the students raised this issue, and the student movement didn't immediately start with these wide-scale mobilizations. So you had a number of students, particularly in the political science department, that raised these issues. And what they pushed for initially, especially in the 1940s and 50s, was land reform. They wanted reform. They wanted a redistribution of land. They wanted absentee landlordism, which is at very high rates, particularly in central, western, and southern Ethiopia, to be mitigated. And that land question was not addressed. And again, this is what I mean by some of these contradictions, where it could have been addressed earlier, yet the parliament at the time, which was dominated by landholding aristocracy, didn't want to pass these land reforms. And so we see the student movement kind of gaining more momentum. We see the government, the imperial government, being highly repressive, really violent towards students. And this only encourages them to kind of mobilize stronger. And we see the birth of the slogan, land to the tiller, or Maris Larashu in Amharic, which comes to symbolize this time in this era, right? And along with the land question, I think the nationalities question is another one that was raised at this time. It animated a lot of debate and a lot of polarizing debate as well. And the most popular text in this regard is Waleli Makonnin's On the Question of Nationalities, where he outlines a vision of what the Ethiopian state is, right? So it's not a state, as some have believed, that has existed for thousands of years, and its people have always been kind of holding hands and singing eating kubaya and living wonderfully, that it is not a place with different sort of ethnicities, but a place with different nationalities. There are different nations that have been incorporated into the Ethiopian state, some willingly, but oftentimes in really violent and dispossessive manners. And that to really address the ills at the center of the Ethiopian state, right, Walaling, this nationalities question has to be addressed. This nationalities question has to be answered. So it is another important element. I should say at this time that some members of the student movement did not particularly like that this was addressed, that this was discussed, and I think that indicates how deep the problem went, right? And finally, the democracy question, the elusive question was raised. The students wanted representation for themselves, for their families, and at this time, the emperor was a totalitarian ruler, right? So it was absolute. His power was unquestionable. He was likened to like a supernatural, like deity at times, but there was no democracy at all. There was no participation. There was no sort of constitutional democratic monarchy. It was a totalitarian regime, which oppressed, again, the vast majority of the people. So the students raised these questions. So there were also a number of other questions as well, but the land question, the nationalities question, the democracy question, informed by a very Marxist-Leninist lens through which they understood the historical development of society in Ethiopia, I think spurred the movement. And we see the influence of these three issues, I think, even in the present. But in 1974, Derg comes into power, and Derg was made up of military officers. I don't know what their kind of ideological orientations initially were. It's not very clear what Mangusta Hailemariam's ideological orientation was, but what it was able to do was take the temperature of that country at the time exceptionally well. So the Derg immediately adopted these left-wing talking points and ideologies of the student movements, right? So it was simply kind of capitalizing on these groups and organizations that existed, either EPRP or Maison, yet there's not a very clear indication that it actually adhered to these principles. So socialism was declared, or Hibrat as it was called in Amharic, and Marxism-Leninism was kind of rammed down everybody's throats, but it mostly stayed at the level of rhetoric, except for a few material changes that were made. And this is in 1975 and 76, we see the nationalization of land. And this was almost a direct response to the question of land, right? The students said land to the tiller, and this was kind of giving the land back to the tiller. So all land was nationalized, landlordism was abolished, absentee landlordism in particular was abolished. In some places, tenants actually chased away their landlords. In some places, unfortunately, landlords were killed. But we see that they're addressing this one question, right? The land question, for now at least, whether one agrees with it or not, was addressed at this time. And the nationalities question was also, there was an acknowledgement of it. And I think what's really interesting when we're talking about the nationalities question in Ethiopia is people often think that it began in 91, but absolutely not, right? So we know that the Derg actually grappled with this question, talked about minority nationalities, talked about the uneven relationship between the different nationalities within the Ethiopian state. So the Institute of Nationality Studies was established at this time. So it dealt with it. And I think the different student movements had also adopted different positions. So some were like pure Marxists. They believed that class was the only distinction that matters. So the nationalities question was completely unimportant to them. Whereas some, including EPRP and Meiso, acknowledged the importance of the nationalities question and actually talked about self-determination, although secession was treated with a very significant degree of suspicion among the student movements that were kind of active at the time. And of course, the EPRP, Meiso, and a lot of young intellectuals, urban intellectuals were getting hunted down and killed during the Red Terror. And we know all the brutalities that were enacted on the people of that country during this regime. Yet that initial response to the land question and kind of a tepid addressing, or at least acknowledgement of the nationalities question at the government level is attempted here. Yet the democracy question, we know, obviously was not answered at all. It was fully authoritarian, totalitarian regime. And then you have the EPRDF era, and the students, and they were largely students that formed or participated in the early days of these organizations that would become the EPRDF. And this includes young student activists that would form the TPLF. We know young student activists that formed the OLF had a very clear understanding. There's a very clear kind of historical thread connecting the student movement of the 60s and the 70s to what would become the ideological foundation of these liberation fronts, or what would later become liberation fronts. There was an acknowledgement that the land question to some degree had been answered, but that it hadn't been implemented fully, right? So yes, the reform was passed and the proclamation was passed, but its effects were uneven. So there was some discussion about kind of evening out these effects. And I think what was really important for the various liberation fronts was the nationalities question, right? They believed and articulated their views that the Ethiopian state it was called the prison house of nations, right? That there are fundamentally uneven relationships that have been baked into the cake of the Ethiopian state. And these different groups suggested their own ways of dealing with it, ranging from secession to kind of downplaying these national differences, confederation, federation, all of these systems were discussed. Right. And I should note here that OLF was actually formally a part of the EPRDF, but as a liberation front, I think it also has its roots in some of these early student movement ideologies. And so when the EPRDF comes into power in 1991, and when the Constitution is approved in 1994-95, we see that there is a response given to the nationalities question. Now, again, one might like this answer, one might not. I know it's a very polarizing issue, but the nationalities question was answered by the adoption of multinational federalism, right? And the Constitution of the country explicitly acknowledges this tumultuous past that the various nations have had. It acknowledges these patterns of oppression and exploitation and marginalization that have characterized the recent history of that country, and attempts to address it by guaranteeing nations and nationalities the right to self-governance and to self-determination. So in theory, at least, and on paper, the nationalities question at this point gets addressed in a way that satisfies most, if not all, groups, right? And so you kind of move on. So now we've kind of answered the land question, kind of answered the nationalities question, the democracy question, unfortunately, still at this time remains unresolved. And I think is kind of ironic because the democracy question, answering that would have enabled successive regimes to answer all of these other questions. But unfortunately, it's the hardest one to come by. But you see these issues emerging again and again as how central they are to the political discourse. And in some ways, these are existential questions. And in 2018, you see the rise of Abiy Ahmed and you see the PP. And immediately, there aren't efforts to kind of redress these things, right? So the land question kind of remains the solution that was given by DERG and then continued on with the EPRDF, continues in place. There are some prominent voices that are pushing for land privatization, but I think that's an issue that until now at least hasn't been seriously touched. I think there have been some serious conversations about it. And there were questions swirling around the nationalities question, right? So Abiy himself and his closest advisors seem to have kind of a disdain for the system of multinational federalism. They seemed to espouse and support civic nationalism, the idea of one overarching Ethiopian identity. I think Medemar kind of also alludes to that. We're all kind of added up together. So their treatment of the nationalities question wasn't very clear. And there was certainly a kind of a centralizing tendency. There was a hearkening back to an imperial era, oftentimes very explicitly to deepen the sense of Ethiopian nationalism, however they defined that. There was kind of an explicit derision of groups and nations that talked about this problem, this history as kind of dividers, as problematic elements within the society as a whole. But then on the other hand, you see that 2 new regional states, I believe, were granted statehood. And so there's an adherence there. And as with everything else, it really waffles back and forth between one or the other. But the land question is kind of right for now, at least, is kind of stayed the same, but we'll see what the future holds. The nationalities question, I believe, is still uncertain. And we know for sure that the democracy question has definitely not been answered. Whatever progress had been made towards democratization, I think Abiy views himself as not as the head of the executive, but rather as like an emperor. And so that question certainly hasn't been answered. But I am often struck by how these questions continue to emerge again and again in the Ethiopian political discourse and political consciousness. And yet the different answers that have been given in some ways have built on one another. And I think what distinguishes Abiy and the PP is that this long kind of trend of left wing, if not left, left leading, left wing kind of radical tradition that began in the 1960s and 70s kind of carried on through all of the other eras, yet seems to have stopped and seems to have been interrupted. We see the entrance of right-wing elements, we see populism, we see narrow notions of nationhood, right? The question of nationalities just becomes the Ethiopian nation, which a lot of nations and nationalities contest, right? But again, I don't think we can kind of deny the centrality of these questions.
Well, that was gripping. Thank you for the excellent analysis and description of the fundamental problems that have defined Ethiopian movements through the generations. And listening to you, my sense is that you think Derg, as murderous and inept as it was, did really try to, at the very least, address the land question. And the EPRDF also, not just the land question, but also try to address the nationality question, and had flirted with the idea, or at least with an attempt to try to address the democracy question. And it would seem to me that until the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed, there had been an incremental kind of solution to all the problems, the three problems mainly, the land question and the nationalities question, and also the democracy question. And it would seem to me that now the regime has walked back on even the nationalities question, because, like you alluded to, there has been attempts to change the parliamentary system to presidential system. Maybe that in and of itself might not be a problem, but I think that the underlying thinking is that they are, at least they thought that a more kind of unitarian system would be better than the one that Ethiopia has today. Is that right? That the Abiy regime has undone some of the things that had been, some of the positive things that had been achieved by the previous regimes?
I think that's fair to say, and I think in terms of kind of clarity, the reforms that the Derg undertook, I think it didn't have a choice. I don't think it was necessarily rooted in ideology, because I don't know how deep that understanding of actual practices of Marxism, Leninism went, but because it rose to power on the backs of the student movement. And the number one concern articulated by students was of the land question. I don't think Derg had any alternative, so it had to address that. So this question was that pressing that it had to be addressed, or there was no way for them to continue staying in power. And I think a lot of the ideas they adopted, a lot of the ideology and rhetoric they employed was just co-opted from the students, right? And I think that's one of, with studying Ethiopian history, you're not short on tragedies, but I think that's one of the most tragic eras, is how quickly and frequently these genuine grassroots movements get usurped by authoritarian rulers. And there was a very famous saying at the time, right, particularly during the Red Terror, where in Amharic people would say "Abiy Ahmed," and I think it's a painful yet so important to kind of keep in mind, because these students that pushed for these changes, that pushed for these transformations, that brought about and discussed and contextualized these ideas that would come to characterize the Derg regime, were mercilessly and often very brutally killed by the regime, right? So I don't know what element or what percentage of the adoption of the land reform stemmed from an actual understanding of the complexity of the issue, and what part of it stemmed from just simply co-opting the intellectual labor of the students that fueled it. But there is no denying the fact that this was an answer. And again, it may be satisfactory to some, surely will be unsatisfactory to others, but this was an answer that was given to this question. And the EPRDF government certainly did address, very explicitly grappled with the nationalities question. And to a degree, there wasn't really an alternative here either, because the way that they rose to power, the different coalitions that were formed along national lines. So you needed to have a system that acknowledged and respected these nations as nations in order to proceed. And so my reading of it also is that there is kind of a backslide, if you will. There is an attempt to kind of redress some of these issues that were already addressed. Again, there was a brief flirting with the land question for a short period of time. I don't think it went really anywhere. There was a contentious relationship between the PP and the nationalities question, right? They seemed to kind of have this deep disdain for it. They were harping on about the national Ethiopian identity for a time, yet seemed to have reversed course. Obviously don't respect nations and nationalities' right to self-governance and self-administration. So I think this moment is also unique for the disjuncture it represents, for that long intellectual history that was informed and rooted in the 1960s and 70s student movement being very violently kind of interrupted. But it is difficult to say with any certainty because the ideology here is not very clear. We don't know that the things that we're talking about today will be relevant tomorrow when Abiy Ahmed wakes up and makes whatever decision kind of floats his boat at a given time. It's a little facetious, but I don't think that's untrue. So I agree that there is a very clear disjuncture here that we are seeing. And I don't think that disjuncture is guided by a clear ideology. I don't think it is guided by kind of a productive force, if you will. It doesn't aim to produce things. It tells us that it does, but we've not seen it aim to produce things. It stands oftentimes in opposition to things that already exist and does not seem to really fully grasp the full scope of the problems that plague that country still.
Yes. So on the nationalities question, Fifi, in 2018, at the height of the so-called Cairo and the Fandom movement, that effectively brought an end to the APRDF regime. I think that the question then seemed to be that they wanted more, at the very least, on the part of the Cairo, they wanted more devolution, more decentralization, and not more kind of more centralization, right? It was obvious to any observer that that is what they wanted. That's what they were after. Why and how did the PP people, the people who made the decision to form the Prosperity Party and to then go on to do the thing that they have been doing, not least the atrocity that they have been unleashing in Tigray, and because fundamentally the Tigray question remains that Tigray wants more autonomy, more independence, right? And the attack against Tigray is because the federal regime doesn't want Tigray to get more autonomous, and the same applies to Oromia. But my question to you, I'm really fascinated to hear what you would say here, is why did the PP decide that what needed to be done was more centralization and not less in 2018?
I think that's a very important question. And I don't think anybody on the outside, such as myself, can say with certainty why they did that. But I think we see here another instance of an authoritarian regime that rises to power on the backs of the organic protests of grassroots movements and often young people, and turns around and weaponizes the state apparatus against those very same young people. that led these protests. So we see this in the wars that Abiy has been waging across Oromia, right? Even before the genocidal war on Tigray started, this has been going on. We know that it's intensified in the last couple of weeks. So we see another instance of authoritarianism rising on the backs of the genuine concerns that were expressed by regular people. And I don't know why they adopted sort of more centralization as a response to that. It seems counterintuitive. And I think the response to that, or at least a portion of it, may lie in the simple fact that politics is about power and is about control. So once you assume power, and somebody as quite desperate for power as Abiy and the people that surround him, once they've attained that power and that influence, once they sit on the top of a governance regime that did have very significant control across that country, there was very little incentive for them to give that up, right? And it's simple, it's kind of Machiavellian, but I don't think there was a big ideological calculation behind why that happened. They realized that, okay, Abiy realized specifically that he controlled state power, and so he was okay with it. So I think that's certainly a part of it, because the enduring questions that were raised by the youth that took to the streets in 2014 and in the years since really remain to be answered, right? There was more devolution of power that was requested. There was a fairer distribution of resources and benefits from the state that were requested. There was a very immediate request to stop the annexation of land, to stop the expansion of urban spaces at the expense of the rural areas surrounding Addis Ababa in particular, which is very specific to 2014 and the master plan. And there were kind of calls to actually implement fully the promises of multinational federalism as articulated in the Ethiopian constitution. And I think all of these kind of fly in the face of, or Abiy's decisions fly in the face of all of these requests that were put forward by the people. And we certainly see that. So the only reason that I can think of is that they believe this is their path to maintaining their grip on power. And part of why this war against Tigray has been so punishing, a part of it at least, is this threat that Tigray and the Tigray regional government represents to the vision of Ethiopia that they may have, one that is centralized and under their power and completely under their grip. And anybody that kind of doesn't toe that line will face the type of atrocities that we have seen being unleashed on the people of Tigray for 18 plus months now.
Well, yes. So, if the attempt to centralize power was an attempt to accumulate more power, then I think it's fair to say that it has backfired. I think a reasonable person now would say that the PP and especially Abiy is in a very precarious situation, an untenable situation. And I think it's a matter of when, rather than if, that is going to be removed. But in terms of the independence struggles, so-called independence struggles, for instance, led by the TPLF and also in Oromia by the OLF and the various other independent movements, I think in one way or another, in their own way, they have been trying to address one or more of the questions that you raise, of the fundamental three questions that you raise. And I think the way that they are portrayed and the way they are perceived by the international community hasn't entirely helped their cause, because they are almost always invariably seen as an angry group of men without any solid foundation or ideology that who have been motivated to go into the bushes because they are angry about the system, but without any concrete plan how to solve the problem. And why? So my first question is, why do you think the international community has a tendency to paint liberation movements in Africa in a negative light? And do you also think that they themselves haven't really helped in the way that they have framed their struggle? For instance, the TPLF, maybe if it had said that it was in favor of some positive cause that the West or the international community would find palatable, maybe it would have been in a much, much better position today. What are your thoughts about that?
So that's it's a question that's near and dear to my heart, because I can't tell you the number of times I've seen the headline rebels or secessionists or insurgents or guerrillas and just been very frustrated, because what that inevitably does is it reduces these movements that have very clear ideological, political foundations that are fighting for a cause rather than fighting just for the hell of it. And it puts them in this very tiny box where it's easy to kind of categorize and ultimately disregard them. And I think this is rooted in how the international arena is structured. It's international relations that has a very Eurocentric frame of reference. So the Westphalian state emerged in Europe, and that's been kind of the barometer of, or the yardstick against which all states are kind of measured and seen. And so states in the African context, regardless of the fact that they are very recent creations of oftentimes violent colonialism, are seen as kind of states in the same way that European states or Westphalian conceptions of states are. And so anybody that stands in opposition to that, I think they treat it as though, like if you're in Europe, for instance, if you're in the UK, they would see it as a group of men oftentimes, but women too, kind of picking up arms and trying to fight the Boris government, right? That's the yardstick through which they measure or understand these other groups, these liberation fronts. And it's very easy to kind of categorize them into this category of rebels or secessionists, because it is a frame of reference that when it comes to Africa, the international community, be it academic or international governance organizations, very easily understand, right? And there is an image that they associate with these types of movements of kind of people and military fatigue, sometimes holding guns, burnt out tanks, a lot of the imagery that we've unfortunately been treated to over the last 18 months as well. And so I think the general Eurocentrism of the frames of reference that we have kind of prevents us from being able to recognize the ideological foundation of the struggles that these various groups, in the Ethiopian case, these liberation fronts have waged historically and continue to wage today. And I think a part of it is also like it's easily digestible and it sells, right? So it's like the rebels took X, Y, and Z, or the rebels did this and that. Then that becomes really easy to understand. You can sell a lot of newspapers, you can sell a lot of magazines, you can get a lot of clicks on your news article, and you don't really need to do a deep dive into what it is that they are actually rebelling against. Because if you did, you would recognize that there is something much deeper going on there. And some of them are indeed secessionist groups, and some of them are not, right? But there is a tendency to kind of paint with a broad brush. And I think it gets relegated to, oh, yet another conflict in a remote part of the world. Oh, those people are always fighting. Type of things. I think these are parts of the reason why. And because the international community is made up of states that tend to be very protective of their statehood, right? The US wouldn't tolerate a secessionist group or a group perceived to be secessionist within its borders. In fact, it very famously went to civil war to avoid secession, right? European states also deal with versions of this. In Spain, they've had secessionist movements. In Northern Ireland, not necessarily secession, but you do have this kind of division between the Republic and the UK. And these states are very kind of protective of the fact that their statehood is recognized internationally, and they think it would set a very dangerous precedent if so-called secessionist groups were to win, right? And I think in terms of the groups themselves helping things. And I think this is not a very scientific assessment, but I think there's a certain strand of stubbornness that is very evident in the political arena. In the Ethiopian context, there is a tendency to be very uncompromising. And when you're looking at these organizations, and I was recently reading some of the earlier manifestos of the liberation fronts, including the TPLF and the OLF that was published in the early 1970s, soon after, I believe, Derg took over, and you see how deeply rooted these beliefs are. The idea that there has been massive exploitation, the idea that the nationalities question is so central to how the country has emerged and how it came to be. The kind of push and urgency with which they articulate these problems and they envision these solutions to them, it really can't be ignored. So that's why it's so frustrating when this ideological component is missed, because that ideological component is the strongest part. So we know that these liberation fronts oftentimes held like educational sessions and teach-in sessions so that their members at large understood what the struggle was about. And I think it would have seemed or been hypocritical and dishonest and disingenuous to the struggle they were waging had they simply presented a different face to the international community, or they simply kind of folded. And we have to remember that for a long time, particularly during the Derg era when the liberation fronts were fighting, they explicitly named imperialism, Soviet imperialism, American imperialism as their enemy. They had no reason to capitulate to these forces because they recognized them as their enemies. They recognized their struggle against capitalism at home, bureaucratic capitalism, they called it, is a very interesting phrase, and imperialism and fascism domestically from Derg as well. So they didn't have a reason to say, well, actually, we're gonna work with you. And partly that worked, right? So when you had some of these liberation movements that were able to forge relationships with countries in the global north, the US, for instance, and undertake negotiations. Now, when they came to power, there was a kind of a tempering of some of this rhetoric. So I don't know that it would necessarily be the simplest task for them to just kind of abandon them in the hopes that they will get alliance from the international community, which has proven itself to be rather fickle.
Well, yes, right. But I think I will start by the last point you raised, which is that the alliance from the international community has proven to be illusory and fickle, as it put it. But I think to kind of still man the argument of the people who say that the so-called rebel movements could have couched the language and the cause of their struggle in a way that the international community could find palatable. I think, for instance, if the TPLF or the Tigray government today framed the struggle not in terms but in ideological terms, for instance, a fight in defense of federalism, then it would have been easier for the international community, who have a natural predisposition to support certain causes and to be repulsed by other causes, for instance, anything to do with ethnicity, nationality, or independence or autonomy. So I think the argument seems to me that they should have been kind of savvy and clever in the way they frame their movement and the code that they are after.
Okay, in what ways do you think they could have reframed it?
You know, if for instance the Tigray government should have framed the whole war and the storyline by saying that they are fighting for federalism, for more decentralization rather than for independence, or for anything that would imply that they are after independence.
Sure. I was actually asking you in what ways they could have reframed it, and you gave me an example. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't actually recall the Tigray regional government releasing anything in public communications saying that it was fighting for independence or secession. There was nothing in the two statements that were released over the summer of 2021 that indicated that they were fighting for independence or required secession. In fact, a lot of the points emphasize the need for an all-inclusive national dialogue and for the need for all stakeholders to participate in deciding what the future would look like for Ethiopia, and that didn't exclude anybody. So maybe I'm missing something, but I do not recall seeing statements that this is what they were pursuing or were interested in doing. So I think in that instance, they did communicate their desires well, right? And there's no accounting for what individual parts of the government and people in the diaspora, they did have quite a significant influence, what they believed, what they thought. We were asked this question all the time as well. And I mean, so people can have their individual views and opinions, but as a government and as a movement, as a regional government in particular, this wasn't clearly stated. But do feel free to correct me if that's not correct.
No, I don't have anything to correct you. I agree with you, Fifi. I think I would imply more like the general sense of how maybe not so much by the Tigray government itself, but maybe by the advocacy and by the international media. They have been portrayed as though they are after independence, if they could have things their way, right? That's generally the feeling you get among serious people in terms of how they think or what they think the TPLF or the Tigray government is trying to achieve. But I think you have a good point there. So I think we've been talking for more than 2 hours, although it feels like 5 minutes for me, at least for me. And we would be remiss if we don't talk a bit about the war and about how you think it could be ended. But before we go into that, I would like to ask you, because you spend your time thinking, analyzing how people think, in intellectuals and politicians and all that, when the Tigray government decided to hold elections apparently in defiance to a decree by the federal regime to ban elections, for me, for instance, it was obvious that it was something that Ethiopia needed in terms of regions flexing their muscles, right? That's how you would go to more decentralized and more kind of devolved system when regional governments and regional people say that we're going to do things their way. And I would, in my naivete, I would have expected a lot of people from Ethiopia, a lot of serious people in Ethiopia to say, well, that's in principle good. It's good that the Tigray government is defying the federal government, because that's the only way we could become more decentralized and more stable country. But the fact that there was a shortage of people outside Tigray ready to express support to Tigray really, really baffled me. Did you have the same kind of sentiment then, Fifi? Were you surprised by the lack of people who kind of saw that there was a virtue, even if you didn't like the TPLF, but there was a virtue, there was something good about the fact that they were defying a federal government?
You know, I can't say that I wasn't very surprised, partly because the recent kind of political mobilizations that led up to the 2018 and Abiy's rise to power, I think showed it was an early indication in some ways of some of the dangerous rhetoric that would come to characterize this particular war. And I think a part of that is explained in the fact that the popular perception, at least among those who could kind of sway political power, the perception that they had of the TPLF, not just as a regional party, but related to the time that they were a part of the EPRDF, the perception that the TPLF just wanted power, just wanted to come back to Addis, just wanted X, Y, and Z, although that wasn't supported by the decision that was being made at the time, which is to have or hold regional elections. I think that is part of what fueled the kind of apathy, if you will, or even like strong support for the government's decision to crack down on the Tigray region's decision to have this election.
Yes. So one final question. I think it's fair to say that whatever the problems in Ethiopia are, and there are a lot of them, the Prosperity Party is not an answer. I think of that there is no doubt. But if some people who are serious, who spend their time thinking in ideological terms, were listening to us, what are your words of advice to them? What do you think serious people in Ethiopia should be doing now? And what kind of ideas should they be trying to implant in the country for it to have any chance of remaining a country and having a future?
there's so many political problems and crises in that country. And I think if we look back to the history of political mobilizations and political dynamics, some of the answers may be gleaned there. But at the most basic level, and sometimes when we have these abstract conversations, we forget sort of material conditions that people are in. So the very first thing is you have to let people live, which the government is actively preventing. The government didn't just wage a devastating genocidal war, which it continues to wage against the people of Tigray. It's not just waging war in Oromia, it's not just waging all sorts of conflicts across that country, but it is also through its inhumane siege bringing about the destruction of an entire group of people, right? So we know that even despite the fact that a so-called humanitarian truce was announced by the government, that trickles, like droplets of aid are only now just making it into Tigray. It's far below what the people need to survive. We know that there have been starvation-related deaths. We know that hundreds of thousands of people are living in conditions of famine, while millions more are on the brink. We know the devastation that has been inflicted on health facilities, on educational facilities, on how weaponized sexual and gender-based violence has completely decimated the lives of tens of thousands of women and girls, and also boys and men. I think it's very difficult once you get started to kind of stop counting the roster of atrocities that this government and Abiy Ahmed and PP have inflicted on the people of Tigray and have inflicted across that country more broadly. So while we're having these, abstract and theoretical conversations, again, we're all rooted in our own positionalities. I don't envision a future, or would not like a future, for any of the people within that state that involves the central kind of role, or that entails the continued involvement of Abiy Ahmed and the PP party that brought us to this catastrophic point, right? It's just, and that's not necessarily very scholarly, but I do not think they have the capacity to solve it. I think they need to answer for the crimes that they have committed and continue to perpetuate on thousands and thousands of people, and do not have a role to play in whatever future the peoples and nations within that state decide to kind of pursue, right? And so beyond that, we're kind of moving to the points that have been kind of raised by different groups, right? Be they the OLF or the TPLF or various groups in that country, is this idea of an inclusive national dialogue. Oftentimes, these contradictions, these small issues, or relatively small issues that need to be solved through dialogue and conversation, just escalate. And this has been also an unfortunate consistent in the history of that country, right? From when the students asked for land reform and they got kicked out of school in response during Haile Selassie's era, we're seeing these issues. And, shortly after coming into power, the EPRDF kind of dissolved, and then the PP was formed, and there ought to have been dialogue and conversation about what path to pursue. And the failure to do that, and then Abiy's consequent decision to launch a genocidal war, has cost us how many hundreds of thousands of lives. And I think we lose track of what that actually means to talk about people dying in the hundreds of thousands, but that is the situation we are in right now. And it's very difficult for me to think of any kind of historical equivalent or parallel to that, to how brutally this war has been fought, to how vicious and inhumane it has seemed, to how it seemed like such a fundamental betrayal to all of the things, so all of the political ideologies, to notions of sovereignty, and to the notion of Ethiopia itself that it has actually entailed. It's very difficult to find another instance where something like this has happened. But the present pain is always felt most acutely, I think, and also because it's still ongoing. And so there is a need to acknowledge different viewpoints. There is a need to acknowledge different positionalities and different visions that people have for the future of the country, different nations have, and they're not always gonna be compatible with one another. Politics is a game of give and take, and we're very, very short on the give oftentimes, and there is a tendency to kind of bully and shout and push through whatever changes one desires, rather than an attempt to actually kind of talk through some of these things. And sometimes it's not as straightforward as that, right? Sometimes these visions that different people and groups have, they're mutually exclusive. So it gets really difficult to solve the central issues and the central problems. What we do know for sure is that whatever Abiy is attempting right now is not working. It has cost us so many lives, and unless whatever he is attempting to implement can be stopped and or reversed, then we will continue to lose thousands more. And that is not a loss that that country can afford. That is not a loss that people should have to endure. So whatever future that is envisioned, I think it's very difficult for me to think of Abiy Ahmed and the Prosperity Party playing a productive role in solving the problems that they played an immensely, massively huge part in bringing about. But I suppose I should take my own advice because compromise is important, but I think that's just very, very difficult. And I think what we often lack also is accountability. Crimes have to be answered for, justice needs to be delivered, support and rehabilitation needs to be given to communities before we even talk about, okay, what does this future look like? And I think that has been in short supply in that country. And unless these central problems are addressed, and unless the contradictions and the problems that are embedded in the very center of the Ethiopian state are honestly dealt with, as long as we continue clinging to these myths of being the chosen people or the chosen country or thousands of years of history, then every couple of decades we continue to delve into these devastations that cost so many lives so needlessly. But again, that's not a novel suggestion. Many, many people have said that many, many times. It's just that they've not found a lot of ears that are receptive to these suggestions, particularly among those who hold power. But yeah, I don't see Abiy playing a productive role in the future of that country or the people in it at all.
Well, we could talk about this all night, all day in your time zone, but I think we have to leave it at that. Fifi, thank you so much for your brilliant insights. This was a conversation that I had been waiting for months, and it's been worth the wait. And I hope our listeners will find it as enjoyable and as educational. And I'm sure they will. And thanks for your time, Fifi. Appreciate that. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me, Jack.
Thank you.